Thank you so much. Welcome to the Veterans for Peace panel hosted by our Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, CCMP for short. I'm Marcy Winograd, a proud member of this working group and the coordinator for Code Pink Congress, a campaign to demilitarize US foreign policy. I'm also the co-chair of the End Wars and Occupations team for Progressive Democrats of America. In a few minutes, we will hear from our panelists. They include Eric Edstrom, climate researcher, formerly with US Special Forces, Nick Rabb with the Sunrise Movement, and Adrian Kinney, president of the Board of Directors of Veterans for Peace. First, however, I'd like to share our goals and strategies of the working group in the hope that you'll be joining us to link demilitarizing our economy with reducing the severity of this climate crisis. The mission of the Veterans for Peace Climate Crisis and Militarism Project is to educate and mobilize around the cost of war and militarism as it relates to the climate crisis and the increase of greenhouse gases. We know that war is not green, war economies are not green. Historically, the United States has insisted that reductions in military greenhouse gas emissions not be included in international UN treaties. We'd like to see that reversed at the next UN conference, the COP26, that's Conference of the Parties, the 26th Climate Agreement, planned for November in Glasgow, Scotland. Our areas of focus as a working group include, number one, the unequal burden of both climate change and militarism on people of color, the poor, the young, the carbon footprint of the US military, which is larger than that of many countries, how these wars for oil and other resources support the fossil fuel-based status quo, and the enormous financial cost of US military and its wars, which could be used instead to address the climate crisis, so the opportunity cost. Representatives of our working group have been working. They have met with climate envoy John Kerry's staff rather, to urge Kerry to include the reduction of military greenhouse gas emissions in international treaties to talk about the importance of demilitarizing this economy. Our call to do so has garnered support from prominent leaders and organizations in the anti-war and climate movements, including 350.org. These organizers signed on to our letter to Kerry articulating those requests. The Veterans for Peace Climate Crisis and Militarism Project also drafted a resolution that Congresswoman Barbara Lee has agreed to introduce in-house. This resolution calls for the Pentagon to track and report its greenhouse gas emissions. We will ask you to go to the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project website that we're posting in the chat to join our working group. At our web portal, you will see a robust resource page with articles you can share on the connections between militarism and global warming. We also ask that you sign the Google form in the chat to volunteer to reach out to your congressperson to co-sponsor Barbara Lee's resolution, and we'll talk more about that later. The CCMP group has also produced a PowerPoint presentation that we are taking on the road to increase awareness about the connection between militarization and global warming. A lot of people aren't talking about this. We need to talk about it. Today, before our panel gets underway, VFP's Gary Butterfield and I will share a few slides with you in the hope that you will also want to take this slideshow to allies in the peace movement and the environmental movement. Gary is the presentation chair of our group today, and he's a lifetime VFP member. Gary, take it away.
Thanks, Marcy. I appreciate it. Thank you all for attending this workshop. There's a lot of things going on at the convention, a lot of interesting issues that Veterans for Peace is addressing, and we're all looking at what to do with our limited time. And one of the things that we did with our working group, with our project, is to develop a presentation that would supplement the knowledge base of our local VFP chapters, and also to show the links to militarism has to climate damage for our environmental colleagues. I know locally here in San Diego, it seems that the climate and environmental groups seem to have a blind spot when it comes to the military's destructive contributions to the climate crisis. For whatever reason, It seems that veterans occupy a unique position in this society, almost of reverence, but certainly of respect. So we felt that a starting point to link these two existential threats together would be to provide a presentation that a trained group from our project could deliver to local chapters, and from there build a base to reach out to local climate, environmental, church, and political groups within their own communities.
So we're going to show you a couple of slides today to get you interested. You can see here that the United States military is the largest institutional consumer of oil and a tremendous emitter of greenhouse gases. A lot of people are not aware of this. For example, one of the military's jets, the B-52, consumes about as much fuel in 1 hour as the average car driver uses in 7 years. Gary.
Part of the structure of this slideshow is to look at the pollution that the military produces. Fossil fuels is certainly one aspect of it. If we were to look at the institution of the Pentagon, the US military, it actually by itself emits more carbon dioxide than many nations. I think there's about 193 nations, and the US military would rank probably around 47th. That's right up there with some of the mid-sized nations. And to hear that the climate people aren't even considering these emissions is really a travesty. So that's one of the key points we're trying to make here.
So in talking about this, we need to look into the future. You know, the World Bank is estimating that we will have close to 150 million climate refugees by 2050. Others think that's an underestimate. There'll be a lot more. And what we want to talk about is how we're going to be responding to this climate crisis. We don't want to see further militarism, which is what the Department of Defense is planning for, you know, these high walls and criminalizing climate refugees. So we have to be prepared for that conversation as well.
So the slideshow is comprised of about 25 to 30 slides. We focus on the military's contribution and the pollution it creates, but we also have a section on how our wallets and pocketbooks are affected by the tremendous amount of money that is thrown at the military industrial complex, and that is routinely voted on and passed by members of both political parties. So at the conclusion of the slideshow, we ask, what can we do? What concrete steps can we actually do as we get started in linking these two existential threats together? Well, we would ask you, all you members who showed up here, to commit to find one group for the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project to show this slideshow and get involved in discussions and conversations so that people become more aware of the problem and what the solution might be. We're also looking for your help in gaining congressional support for Barbara Lee's House resolution, which is going to be introduced very shortly, in looking at transparency of military emissions. We need your help on this. And then, of course, continue to demand Congress cut at least $200 billion from the bloated Pentagon budget, which incidentally, under the Democratic President Biden, was actually increased over what it was from the prior administration.
Yes, so we want congressional liaisons who will be developing relationships, not just with the congressperson themselves, but also their staff, because sometimes these staffers are incredibly influential. And we know that we are stronger together and that it's going to take all of us to reduce the corporate war machine. So please, we encourage you to think about, who do I know? What groups am I involved with? Who can I reach out to see if they'd be interested in this PowerPoint presentation? And that doesn't mean that you have to show it, although we would love for you to show it. But what that means is that we want you to make the outreach and to let us know by telling us in the chat, filling out the form, that there is a group that's interested in seeing this slideshow.
Let me just add, Marcy, thank you for that. There is a form on our website to schedule a presentation. There's also a simple form to fill out if you want to join and help us develop this congressional liaison. We need constituents that we can use as an entry point to these Congress people. So give that some thought and look at our website. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, let's get on with our panel. I'd like to first introduce Eric Edstrom. Eric is the author of the book Un-American, A Soldier's Reckoning of Our Longest War, told from the point of view of a platoon commander, Eric, in Afghanistan. A graduate of the U.S. Army Ranger School, Eric was selected for the U.S. Special Forces. After the military, he went on to earn both an MBA and a Master of Science studying climate change from Oxford University. After graduate school, Eric moved to Australia for 5 years, where he worked as a management consultant for both Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey & Company. He lives in Boston. Eric, so glad you could join us today.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. I really appreciate the warm introduction. And I figured that I would probably explain just a little bit more about some of the stories behind the intro that we just received from Marcy. And then I will sort of transition into a little bit more of a discussion about why I focused and pivoted from a career in the military towards studying climate change, and then ultimately speaking out about militarism in an effort to sort of redraw the prioritization of America towards the issues that matter most. So indeed, I am a Massachusetts native. I did graduate from the West Point class of 2007 and was inspired in my high school years in the sort of zeitgeist and jingoism of post 9/11 America to serve. And after graduating, I found myself in direct combat in Kandahar, leading about 30 soldiers, light infantry soldiers, who came from all walks of life. And we incurred about 25% casualties during that tour. Some were blown up in vehicles. One was shot by a negligent discharge from the Afghan National Police, and other incidents as well. And I sort of saw the long tail costs of wars affect my soldiers also. You know, even to this day, soldiers that are in drug or alcohol abuse rehab, soldiers that have committed suicide, and those that have had just a tremendous struggle trying to reassemble the pieces of their life back in some sort of shape as they re-enter the private sector. And, you know, throughout that period of time, I sort of realized that if I continued with my career path, I would probably have this recursive loop of deployment upon deployment upon deployment, going to a war that I ultimately believe was not just a mistake in terms of strategy, but a crime, and a moral crime as well. And I could not justify it to myself, you know, at the end of my life, as you sort of reflect back on the way that we have treated, you know, the people of Afghanistan or other countries, including Iraq. I could not in good conscience feel like I was in some benevolent way helping them. Towards the end of my service, I served in the Honor Guard, firstly as the presidential escort platoon leader during the Obama administration, and then as the executive officer of Honor Guard Company. And I very quite literally, you know, buried one of my best friends from West Point in Arlington National Cemetery in Section 60, and handed the folded flag to his crying mother. And it was sort of during this period of time that I knew I wanted to redraw the blueprint of my life and do something else. I was aware of climate change and the importance of it, and it sort of continued to build in its importance in my own consciousness, you know, and maybe some people probably of the same age, you know, quote sort of the Al Gore inconvenient truth documentary as being one of those things that sort of spurned them on. And I think that it was sort of around that same period of time that I had this inkling or feeling that our country is just getting our most important priorities, priorities at the strategic level, the $1 trillion investment level, wildly wrong. And we end up spending $6.4 trillion on the war on terror, according to Brown University's Watson Institute, for fully amortized costs, which extend far into the future in terms of veteran care and also servicing the debt obligations from the wars themselves, because of course it was not paid for in taxes. It was paid for and leveraged in debt against the future prosperity of American citizens. But I will get off the MBA soapbox about the financing of it. I saw that climate change was a far more important issue, and I started to see and put together the pieces in my own mind of the interrelationship and interdependency between the misallocation of resources on the military and the sort of growing risk and threat, both in terms of national security, but just global life on this planet in terms of habitability from climate change. And it's sort of about the allocation of those resources. So today, we are playing a negative sum game of Taliban whack-a-mole, where the more we invest, the more we lose. The more soldiers lose, the more the Afghan people lose, and the more the American taxpayer loses. At the same time, because of our dithering on climate change, we're creating a second channel of pain, which will be felt far into the future as well. And it's effectively between the military-industrial complex and American climate policy to draw, perhaps a slightly tortured analogy, but it's a bit like driving a car off a cliff with the steering wheel removed and a brick on the pedal. So I wanted to, after my climate studies, where I studied very literally stranded assets, which is in business terms, the premature write-down or devaluation of different things because of poorly understood climate risk. And you start to understand that everything is affected, every asset class, real estate, land, food and agriculture, and it's all sort of put together. And when you hold up the sort of egregious examples between the amount of emissions that the military produces and the harm, it sort of makes you want to look at a few of the most recent studies. And before this panel, I wanted to do a bit of brushing up on various subjects. So I read a few different reports and journals, and you can draw the connection quite clearly between climate and militarism. There was a study in Nature Communications recently, it was about maybe 2 weeks ago, and it received a tremendous amount of press. And you guys might have seen the articles, it was in The Guardian, the New York Times, et cetera, which highlighted that the sort of takeaway of this research was that the average American produces something like 17 tons of carbon every single year. And over the 3.5 Americans' lifetimes, that would be enough greenhouse gases to kill one person. And this is sort of part of the broader social cost of carbon discussion. So the magic number, according to this study for social cost of carbon, is about 4,400 metric tons of CO2 will end up killing somebody else because of climate change somewhere in the world. The next question then is, how much does the US military produce? Well, if you look at Science magazine, it says, quote, the US military's global greenhouse gas emissions amount to about 593 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent over an 8-year span from 2010 to 2018. That is less than half of the war on terror in terms of total number of years. But doing the quick back of the envelope division in math, even if it is only directionally correct, that means that in 8 years, the US military's carbon emissions has killed about 134,000 people, or 45 9/11s worth of victims around the world, not due to direct combat and ancillary second and third order effects of occupation of countries, not due to direct deaths from bombs or drones or the shortages of medicines or whatever else it may be. This is the sort of knock-on effects just from the climate footprint of military operations. And that number does not include the actual carbon footprint of the military-industrial complex more broadly. This is more just the operational usage. So it puts into context the harm that is done. So when you're talking about the outrage that the war on terror may produce, that it has killed, roughly, according to Brown University Watson Institute, 335,000 civilians, or about 110 9/11s of civilian death. This is basically approaching that same amount if you stretch it out over the full war on terror. And when America fully removes itself from some of these countries or draws down its footprint, the carbon footprint will continue. So even though this part of the war is over, we are still causing harm from the military in terms of mega deaths of climate deaths elsewhere. So we must count all emissions, including military emissions, even if it is politically inconvenient to do so, which is why I'm a huge proponent of Congresswoman Barbara Lee's resolution. So I will pause there. And actually, one more thing is that it calls into question the entire purpose of the US military. Because if we do believe that the US military and its purpose is to try to keep the world safe for democracy, as lofty and ideal as that may be, then how would it possibly be able to do that when it can't even keep the world safe for life on it?
Excellent point.
I'll pass the mic.
I think we all agree with you on that. Yeah, the Pentagon, it's killing us. Thank you so much, Eric Edstrom, an Afghanistan war veteran and author, Un-American, A Soldier's Reckoning of Our Longest War. Our next panelist is Nick Rabb, a Tufts University doctoral student in computer and cognitive science. Nick has been a key Sunrise Movement hub leader addressing the critical impacts of US militarism on climate change and vice versa. Through political education on the interconnections between climate and militarism, he has worked to give organizers a deeper understanding of the militarized protection of government and corporate interests that has led to violent extraction from both people and the planet. Nick also now works with dissenters, building the anti-militarism movement among young people on college campuses. Thank you, Nick. His university research focuses on modeling the spread of misinformation and disinformation and how media or state propaganda campaigns impact public opinion. Welcome, Nick Rabb.
Thank you so much, Marcy. I'm very, very happy to be here and honored to be asked to speak in front of you all. I think what I'm going to talk about complements what Eric mentioned and what you and Gary laid out at the beginning of the presentation very well. Before I go in, though, I just wanted to note, when we're all talking about military budget, that the proposed Senate budget put forth by Senate Democrats that's supposedly so good on climate actually increases the military budget every year until it gets to $880 billion in 2031, which is only a small portion of it, of course, but got to keep an eye on that military budget. So what I'm going to talk about today, because I've worked so much with, from the vantage point of the climate movement, trying to get folks to understand why militarism is so important to the climate crisis, I'm going to bring you on my journey that I went on to understand how militarism is so important to the climate crisis. And to do so, I find it very hard to hold all these things in your head. So I'm going to share some slides that may help us sort of visualize what's going on. So I want to describe to you why the climate crisis and militarism are just two separate things, but that they're actually two parts of the exact same problem. Right? There's a lot of discussion these days, as Marcy and Gary pointed out at the top, about how the military contributes to emissions and pollution. But I want to outline something that gets even deeper than that. So for my work in my PhD, I study complex systems and social networks. And I try to understand, right, how entire systems of interwoven, different actors end up with certain results. And I think we can do the same when we're analyzing how we should be figuring out what to do when we're organizing. Right? So we all know the climate crisis, right? This is what we talk about in the climate movement. And if we analyze the climate crisis sort of as a system, like I did when I started to organize with the Sunrise Movement, right? We started to talk about how the climate crisis is not just about emissions, right? But it's also pollution, right? This is what Sunrise really brought to the environmental movement space, talking about environmental justice, even though a lot of people had been talking about it for a long time, but had just not been recognized. this sort of breached into the national conversation, right? But as I started to learn more and organize more, I saw it even further with the help of other climate organizers, that it's also about over-extraction from the land, right? The ecosystem and how we use the land, it contributes to the crisis just as much as emissions and pollution. And we can ask the question, okay, given all of these inputs to the climate crisis, what are we left with, right? What do we get? And I think we're all very familiar with these, as we probably read or heard about the IPCC report on Monday, and are suffering these enormous heat waves and floods and fires. We see extreme weather, right? We see the ecosystems being destroyed. This leads to resource scarcity, right? And this is what the military talks about a lot. They talk about this resource scarcity aspect. And, we can analyze this as the climate crisis, but we can even take it one step further, right? The climate crisis, right? All of these things, extreme weather and ecological destruction and resource scarcity, these are sort of, not dispassionate things that just happen to nobody, right? But we can talk about the actual effects for people. And I think this is what we need to talk about more, and what has been really successful for the climate movement, talking about what happens to people, right? And when we put people into the equation, we see that all of this stuff leads to migration, right? It leads to destroyed homes, right? Mass species loss, starting a mass extinction, right? It leads to hunger, people losing their livelihoods that they've had for generations, having to move and uproot everything. And it also leads to protest and organizing, right? And these days we see this in the climate crisis, right? A lot of us see this, but a lot of organizing stops right there, right? Let's then organize around the things that stop pollution, right? The things that stop emissions, so we can mitigate the bad consequences. But as I kept thinking about this system, right, the story doesn't stop there. You can ask another question, right? Given all this that's happening, what's the response, right? In the climate movement, we talk about needing a just transition. This is a framework that's used by a lot of different groups and people and organizations that says we radically need to change the way we even relate with each other. We need to change the systems so we can cooperate and create a sustainable world. But the response we get right now is nothing like what we need in a just transition, right? What we get is militarized borders, right? A response of wartime, right? We shore up the borders so nobody can get in, right? We repress all foreigners and ramp up xenophobic politics, right? We wage propaganda campaigns and I say we, but I mean the people in power and in charge, propaganda campaigns to keep public opinion on the side of ruling elites, right? And then suppressing dissent, right? When people stand up and organize, it gets crushed, right? It's as if the people who are holding the keys to making large-scale changes are at war with the planet, right? And with those who wish to be allies of it. And we can even ask, right, who's waging this war? Who's doing all this? It's not us, right? We're not militarizing the borders, right? Why respond this way? Well, this completes the whole picture of this system that I can't help but not see, and I think is important for climate organizers and peace organizers to see, that it loops all the way back to being in support of corporate profits, right? It loops all the way back into being in support of state power, which then feeds back into the system and creates more emissions and creates more pollution and over-extracts. And it gets into this crazy loop that sees the crisis in its complexity. Right? And we can also look at this entire picture, right? And see that maybe, would getting to a planet running on renewables even stop the crisis, right? Just this one tiny section, emissions in the corner. If we slow emissions, how do we end up extracting the resources to make solar panels and wind turbines and geothermal plants? Right? Whose land does that get built on? What happens when we accidentally destroy other parts of the ecosystem that may lead to collapse of these systems that are in delicate balance? And now we have a new crisis, right? With the same system that I call the domination crisis on top. And I think we need to understand that surrounding the climate crisis, it is so hard to do things about it because of this domination crisis, this system of domination that we've set up. Eric couldn't have put it any better. I think about it like being put in a straitjacket by those who hold power. But the visualization of being in a car driving off a cliff with a brick on the pedal and the wheel is gone is exactly the same idea. We have set up this system so we can't do anything about the climate crisis, right? This is an institutionalized system of domination that, as I laid out, perpetuates the climate crisis, but also, in fact, systems of domination probably caused the climate crisis, right? If there weren't concentrated forms of state and corporate power that were able to summon forces of domination to achieve their extractive goals in the first place, things probably wouldn't have even been able to get as far as they have, right? The climate crisis and militarism have the exact same structural underpinnings and the same roots. They are both part of the same loop, the same system. And both parts of the joint crisis cannot be ignored. And I love this one quote that I think ties it up so perfectly. This is a quote by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz from An Indigenous Peoples History of the US. She writes, quote, "People do not hand over their land, resources, children, and futures without a fight. And that fight is met with violence." This is what the system of domination does in order to keep the land, the resources, take people's children and futures. And this has been the story throughout history, right? This is kind of an intimidating looking timeline, but suffice to say, this is just a handful of examples throughout US history where domination has been used at the behest of corporate powers or state powers to gather more resources or to hold on to whatever they don't want to lose when people rise up, right? And this is not just a relic of the past, right? The domination crisis is playing out before our eyes today, including in the US. And I wanted to conclude with one perfect example that people are starting to talk about more in the climate movement, but I think we could all stand to see is really the best example that we have in a sad way of what's going on today. And that's the Line 3 pipeline, right? I don't know if you all are familiar with what's going on, but this is the perfect example of what's going on, right? Take Enbridge Corporation, right? A huge Canadian company seeking to increase profits by constructing a new tar sands pipeline, destroying the ecosystem in the process, adding huge amounts of emissions. So people rise up, right? Those are the photos on the left. People rise up and protest saying, this is not acceptable. You can't destroy our land and our futures. And then what's the response, right? Enbridge, this corporation, backed by the US government to some degree, is able to pay local Minnesota police to harass and dominate Indigenous protesters from this Indigenous-led movement, right? They barricade the camps illegally. They surveil and intimidate everyone who's there. They've shot protesters with rubber bullets. Right? They pepper spray them, arrest them over and over, and impose huge legal fees on them through the courts. And all the while, Enbridge works its PR muscles, right, to suppress what's going on. And the Biden administration looks the other way, right, wanting to keep its image as a climate president, right, in the mainstream or whatever rationale they have. This is the exact same thing as the quote, right? People don't hand over their land, resources, and children, futures without a fight. And the system of domination will always meet that fight with violence. And I just wanted to end by saying we'll all have our Line 3 moment, right? Maybe today we don't have the resources or livelihoods that state or corporate powers want to take against our will, but that may happen someday as the crisis rages on. What will we do then? Will we see the systems of domination as perpetuating the crisis when it finally affects us? Or will we continue to not see that this is an inextricable part of the equation that we have to organize around? So
thank you so much. Nick Rabb, a Sunrise Movement hub leader, organizing youth around connections between militarism and the climate crisis, taking a deep dive into the system of dominance. And Nick, perhaps if you can, please put some of those slides in the chat. Others might want to download them and share them. Appreciate the depth to which you've examined this. And I urge everybody to support those who are on the front lines, the Indigenous women leading this struggle to stop Line 3 in Minnesota. I know Code Pink has been involved, other groups as well. Our next speaker is Adrian Kinney, president of the board of directors of Veterans for Peace. Adrian served in the US Army and Army Reserves from 1994 through 2004 as an Arabic linguist in military intelligence. She was activated in the reserves for 2 years following the events of 9/11 and served stateside as a voice interpreter for operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Adrian Kinney worked in the Department of Veterans Affairs as a health science specialist and as the New England Regional Coordinator for Iraq Veterans Against the War. Adrian is coming to us from New York. Welcome, Adrian, a familiar face.
Yeah, thank you. So I was asked to present Veterans for Peace's perspective on the intersections between the climate crisis and militarism. I would say that those intersections have been very well gone through by Nick and Eric, and I definitely appreciate the information that you've shared. I would say that there are a lot of things that come to mind in terms of my having conversations with people about militarism. And even so, militarism is not just the US military and its impacts on people serving overseas and people in foreign lands. It's also obviously here in the United States. You know, I'm sure everybody who has served in the military knows that when you're on base, you have a complete permission to disregard the local, state, and laws about pollution and how you should use or not use resources. And the pollution, it's a huge problem. Camp Lejeune is just one of the many, many areas where the military was polluting, and it ended up really destroying the water in communities with rippling effects on people's health for decades to come. So I actually wanted to take a bit of time to talk about some of the pitfalls we can fall into when we're talking about climate change. And one of those is to blame there being too many people on the planet. And I personally would have thought that we've learned enough about climate change and, you know, the root causes of so much destruction, havoc in the world, to blame it on too many people. I mean, people ultimately want to do good in this world. I lived in Vermont for 10 years, and they did so many positive things to try to improve the environment. They passed anti-idling laws a decade plus ago. And then Bernie Sanders and Senator Leahy invited the F-35 to come and be based full-time as an operational entity in Burlington, Vermont. And as we've seen, you know, the emissions by a military fighter jet or plane can undo 7 years worth of the struggle of one person in an hour. So, you know, it's very, very, very important. And I know I personally have had those thoughts. You know, the population of the world has tripled in my lifetime. Certainly, the fact that there are more people has some impact on the environment. But, you know, it's not, you have to dive deeper. You definitely have to dive deeper. It's too, you know, I mean, I guess, and I think about this because even in Veterans for Peace, recently we've had conversations where people have said, you know, we have to make overpopulation a priority in addressing in Veterans for Peace as part of our strategic planning. And it's unfortunately that results in people shifting blame from those who have power and could make the right decisions and can choose how we use our resources and how we protect or don't protect our planet onto people without that same power. So, I don't know. I have gone through, to me, it just makes sense to not blame people when corporations, industry, capitalism, concentration of power and resources in the hands of the few is rooted so much in things that are going wrong in our world. But if you look at countries that are the wealthiest, they tend to have a slower population growth than countries that are poor. However, those countries, the rise and use of resources and emissions production skyrocket and largely outnumber all of those emitted by and used by people in poor nations. And I can't emphasize how important it is to not allow ourselves to continuously be brought down into white supremacist and patriarchal and capitalistic arguments that defeat our united goal to actually address the root causes of the problems that we face in our society today. I remember a decade ago thinking how ironic it was that the military was using by far the most resources on the planet in wars that, you know, according to some, are about fighting for resources in other countries. I honestly don't even know if that's the reason why we're fighting wars anymore. I think part of it is because wars make certain people a hell of a ton of money, and they cannot let go of that. I think that people who are rich benefit from having a destabilized world in which the enemy is always somebody else in a foreign country instead of the rich people who are screwing us all over. And it's just, for me personally, it's joining this presentation today is kind of interesting timing because, you know, I've been working with Veterans for Peace. I've been working with the Veterans Anti-War and Peace Movement since 2007. So I'm proud to say that I have been in the peace movement for longer than I have served in the military. So that's definitely a milestone to acknowledge. But I see too many times, even in our peace movements and even in, you know, the people and populations who want to do the right thing, that it is too easy to slip into this counterproductive, blaming each other and people for the problems that ultimately are rooted in ongoing militarism and a small segment of the population who don't care about the rest of us. Because let's face it, when you are rich and when you have the ability to do whatever you want, then you don't have to care about whether or not it's a heat wave that is killing people, because you actually have your nice house with your air conditioning that is destroying the planet. And, you know, whatever other accommodations you might have, whether it be your private jet that is also contributing far more than any poor working class person could ever do to the root causes of climate change. You don't have to care. You don't. So, and I say this, it's just too important, because I have seen people, even within Veterans for Peace, fall into this problem of shifting blame on the wrong people. And honestly, I really appreciate, Eric and Nick, your presentations. I know so much of this information. I used to do kind of a tour around Vermont talking about how we need to connect militarism and climate change. And I would go to these environmental, you know, Solar Fest and other festivals, and talking with people who are really into trying to protect the environment, which honestly is oftentimes kids. It's the youth. It's the first thing that I really got interested in after I got out of the military. I was like, how do we save the planet? And then I got shifted into focusing on how do we end war? And then I realized that it's all the same thing. And, you know, the military is doing such a propaganda piece of trying to say they're becoming a green military, that I had climate activists telling me that the military is doing everything they can to become more environmentally sound. And you can't put LED light bulbs in a nuclear submarine and pretend you're somehow saving the planet. It's, but you know what? The people who own pretty much everything, the government, they also own the media, they also own how we share information aside from the internet, so long as it stays a free internet, and people are able to access it freely and exchange information freely, then no wonder there's so much misinformation. The military has never had to divulge their pollution, their emissions, and it's in large part, I have been waiting for the rest of the world to tell the United States of America to knock our shit off, because we are destroying the world and they are all suffering because of it. So,
yes, I was just going to say, and the world will get that opportunity in November. I believe November 1st through the 12th is the UN climate conference, the COP26, and 100,000 protesters are expected to show up unless Delta derails all of this. But we certainly need pressure both from the outside, I agree, 100%, and as well as from the inside. Thank you so much, Adrienne Kinney, President of Veterans for Peace. We now have about 30 minutes for Q&A. I'll kick it off with a question for Nick Rabb. And then Gary and I will alternate. We're taking questions from the chat and as well as some questions we've prepared beforehand. So let's go. All right, so Nick, how do we engage younger climate activists on militarism and military-caused emissions? How do we make this one of the central themes of the environmental movement?
Well, that's a great question. I've been trying pretty hard for a little while now. I mean, I think, as with a lot of people, I think coming into understanding different aspects of the systems that are contributing to the problem is a process, right? You can't imagine or expect someone to go from A to Z, right? Having started in the systems we get educated under, where we really don't learn anything, unless you're pretty lucky and know some pretty rad people, to going to knowing to know about how climate and militarism are part of the same system. And it doesn't make any sense if you just say it outright. So I mean, this is an organizing tip that I actually talk about in my work on disinformation too. Like, how would you tell someone who's in this crazy world where they don't believe things that are scientifically very, highly agreed upon, that things are scientifically highly agreed upon? You have to try to meet people where they're at, right? So when we're communicating with young people, I think, building trust and sort of starting with where their analysis is coming from is super, super important. And that's why I wanted to structure my presentation as each layer adds on a little bit. And I think that's all of our journeys, even if we don't remember the steps that we took to get along the way. And I think with younger people, it's harder to remember that we are starting from pretty crummy place if we went to public school and didn't learn much. So I think that's a piece of it for sure.
Thank you. Gary? Oh, we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. This is for Eric, and it has to do with the situation in Afghanistan. And from your point of view, what was the real reason we were there? Was it for extractive industries, or was it revenge on some unnamed opponent, or what was the story that you got out of that?
I mean, the stories that I would receive is probably different from reality. I mean, what often you would hear when you were in Afghanistan was that this was in response to September 11th, and it was one of these sort of wars based on terrain denial, that we must be there, otherwise there will be another September 11th. And that is sort of how the flow on logic goes. The problem with the notion that you can fight a war based on terrain denial is that you cannot possibly be everywhere all of the time. There's something like, I think 39 million people in Afghanistan. I'd have to look up the numbers, but if you just deployed a soldier to watch every man, woman, and child in Afghanistan to stop terrorism, first of all, that would be millions and millions and millions of soldiers, but it doesn't actually stop the underlying issue, which, you could just as easily train for and launch a terrorist attack from any number of other places. So it's a completely foolish errand. But to the question that was posed in the Q&A, I absolutely do not believe that mineral extraction, was some sort of large consideration in this. I think it's sort of more about feeling like you need to do something. I joined the military in the wake of September 11th, and that was sort of what inspired me, at least in part, aside from also not having any money for college and that being completely prohibitively expensive. So there's sort of a two-pronged thing, both like a carrot and a stick, where going to college, ironically in America, people are willing to kill or die to get a decent education, which should not, is not the case in many other wealthy countries. But, putting that aside, it was this sort of notion that you don't want to see this happen to your country. America hasn't been attacked very many times in the course of its history. War is always something that's fought on someone else's territory, and they must endure the surrounding impacts from that conflict. So those are sort of the reasons, for me joining the military. But no, I don't believe that there's any sort of conspiracy to heist from the people of Afghanistan their emerald mines.
Thank you, Eric. This question is for all three panelists for your thoughts on this. It's, as Nick pointed out, we have the system of dominance that has set us up on a collision course. And the trajectory is not to reduce the military budget, but to increase it even more. Given the reality and the politics of the United States, does it make any sense to say, if we can't reduce the military budget, can we successfully divert military dollars to climate defense rather than climate militarization of borders, but for a Green New Deal under the military?
What do you mean by climate defense, Marcy?
Well, planting trees, infrastructure repair.
I highly doubt that would ever come under the remit of the military. I mean, it would be interesting to try to reappropriate and change the mission statement of some elements, but I don't think that will ever happen. What I think, and I mentioned it in the chat, but I think predictably, as the social cost of carbon and climate change become increasingly dangerous, that the push is not going to be, oh, we should spend less on the military. We should spend perhaps more on the military to decarbonize it and to secure our bases. So, I mean, it gives a very credible reason to say, hey, all of that equipment that's based on fossil fuels that we've been developing for decades and decades and decades, we agree, climate change is huge. It's a big issue. We should phase all of that stuff out, and you should give us millions and millions of dollars to redesign, actually it would be billions, to redesign an entire new fleet of vehicles, an entire new fleet of aircraft, overhaul the electrical system to basically go into island mode for every single base in the United States and abroad, so that they can be off grid should there be a cyber attack. That will be, I think, sort of the push of the desire for renewable energy and low carbon military solutions for vehicles.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mm-hmm. All right, Gary. Oh, Nick, did you want to say something? We can't hear you.
Oh, no, that's all good.
Okay.
If anything, I was going to say, I don't know if Adrian has thoughts as well, but yeah, I think Eric just nailed it. I mean, the incentives and like the purpose of military is what it is. Like the incentives and purpose of capitalism are what they are. I don't think by trying to rebrand them or covertly shift them bit by bit that we'd be fooling anybody. I think it's too ideologically entrenched to try to pursue that kind of strategy, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
This one is really kind of personal, because we developed this presentation with a view coming from Veterans for Peace to try to reach out and find some common ground and amplify voices about both of these issues. From your points of view, who are maybe half my age, where would you see common ground for us to reach out to younger people to engage them in this discussion? You both want to go first?
That's on you, Nick, because you're with Sunrise Movement. Come on.
I just don't want to take up too much space in case other people want to talk as well.
I think this is a critical point for us to reach out. I mean, time is drawing near here, and we're all in this together. We don't want to see the U.S. become an armed lifeboat, but how do we reach other people quickly?
Well, I'll offer one nugget, and then I'd be curious, Adrian and Eric's thoughts as well. I mean, this is a question that gets posed, I think, between a lot of different groups of people, not just older folks and younger folks, but also white folks and people of color, people who live in the US and people who don't. How do you quickly start to work with people who may not be where you're coming from, right? And I think, unfortunately, through my organizing, I have come to realize that there needs to be a lot of strategic thinking about how to balance urgency with actually building deep trust and not making this a type of transactional thing. It's unfortunate because the climate crisis is urgent, but people will know when you're just trying to make relationships with them because you just want to advance your agenda and don't truly care about them as people. So I think relationship building and trust building needs to be a part of it, but it's very difficult because it takes a long time.
Thank you. This question, well, whoever wants to take it, please talk about GHG emissions of US military bases. Where can we close them, or which bases do you think we might have some success in closing? I know these are tough questions. Any thoughts, Adrian? Bases we could close? Low-hanging fruit?
All of them. You know, I don't know what to tell you. I know that closing bases destroys communities because the military employs a lot of people in local populations, and oftentimes it's lower income people who are working in those places. So I've seen in upstate New York where they've closed Air Force bases and the community is destroyed, and they don't bring in jobs to replace those jobs. So instead of trying to have the military take on undoing the crap they've done to the planet for forever, perhaps we can close bases and then begin new enterprises that can employ people to do some good to the planet, to the environment. I mean, certainly COVID has taught us so much, right? So we've seen so many corporations totally transform what they were building or what they were supplying. I've seen breweries and distilleries start producing hand sanitizer overnight. You see clothing manufacturers start building protective gear and face masks overnight. It is certainly possible to do the radical kind of transformation to our economy that would be required in order to save the planet. And there is hope. So there are two examples. One is when lead was in everything, and lead pollution was astronomical. It was off the charts. And people around the world decided to get lead out of stuff. And we started having unleaded gas and taking lead out of products. And you can see the chart. I've seen a presentation on this, and it's absolutely fascinating that when people actually decided to do something about lead, the lead pollution, it was like a cliff where it just skyrocketed down. And COVID, right? people couldn't travel, people couldn't fly, the cruise ships weren't cruising. And you saw people reporting dolphins returning to their local rivers. The air quality improved, people's asthma and problems with their respiratory conditions, and just it was easier to breathe. So it is certainly possible for us to take the radical kind of transformation if we as people can get united and demand accountability from our government. And you know what? There's no cookie cutter answer to that. I would say that people have to develop allyship in their communities. You know, low income people have been dealing with landfills being put in their backyards for decades, decades and decades and decades. I remember when I was doing my MSW and master's in psychology, where people were talking about not only landfills being in lower income areas, but also even food, right? The crappy food gets sent to low income neighborhoods. The really awesome, nice food gets sent to grocery stores in rich neighborhoods. Like it's so, people in this country in low income areas and diverse areas, they have been struggling with how they can have a safe, healthy environment in their communities for a long time. And they know it's important, and we need to get with them instead of expecting them to get with us.
Good point. Thank you, Adrian.
I could just add one more thing on the bases, is that you really just need to start off with having to make some choices, where if the military budget basically had to account for and report its emissions, and those emissions would effectively be taxed, then they would have to make some decisions about what actually provides national security for the American people. And that would then dictate downstream what bases you might want to close. So, you know, if you said you'd have to pay for your emissions military, then you might start changing the way that you're doing procurement and operations, because the hurdle for keeping a base open or going to war would become increasingly more expensive, because going to war or keeping a base open also causes climate change. So therefore it would be sort of related, and you would have to actually pare down operations to what is truly essential, and make those trade-offs.
So you're saying that perhaps the government could say, all right, if your base is emitting, you know, this many greenhouse gases, you have to set aside part of your budget.
Yeah, have it come out of the budget. I mean, if you say that you can, and carbon taxes are, you know, a good economic way to apply pressure to organizations, corporations, and everyone else to change behavior. If you price in the externalities associated with the damage that's attributable to climate change, and that also was then thrust upon the military, they too would then have to say, how much are you emitting? And that has to be reported. And then as a part of your budget, would be to paying back those emissions that you emitted. And therefore that would drive the innovation towards, low carbon technology, to closing bases that are high footprint, but not strategically valuable. And you would have those downstream effects, because it would become doubly expensive to keep high carbon operations going.
I suppose the same could be said for military contractors, since we contract out so
much,
right? They should be paying.
Well, that's just like other things in this society. The true cost is never really accounted for by corporations. They put something out there like an automobile, and the cost of disposing it, well, that's borne by society, not by the automobile manufacturer. I want to go to a posted question from Cynthia Papermaster now, and I think it's for you, Nick. She says, in my view, the youthful climate movement is key to making progress on the intersection between militarism and climate. Topic once again. would it make sense to form teams of youthful ambassadors led by Nick to approach Sunrise, XR, Youth versus Apocalypse, and the other activist groups?
Y'all love young people. Yeah. Well, that's it's an interesting question. I mean, I think as far, sort of to echo what I was saying earlier, as far as like ambassadorships go, right, they have to in order to be successful, right? If I ask any of my friends in Sunrise, and I know people who work for Sunrise, who like plan a lot of strategy for Sunrise, if I were to ask any single one of them to try to make militarism or anything part of what we organize around, it would be kind of hard. Sunrise at this point is a structure, right? It's like, even if you know people in a corporation, just because you talk to someone near the top of the corporation, does that mean that they're going to change their entire strategy? Well, no. Like, they may have the power to, but they do what they do for a reason, right? And I think like, and this is hard to sort of get around because it can't be like a top-down thing. I truly think like, if anything was to move young people as much as young people have been moved around the climate fight, it has to be that same wave of like realization and organizing that came from the bottom to spark the first climate realization in the first place. It can't just be like okay, now Sunrise adopts this and now every young person believes in it. It's like, and it makes it hard because those moments in our organizing theory, we call them moments of the whirlwind, when everyone gets swept up in like last summer with the protests for Black Lives and the uprising. That was a moment of whirlwind where now so many young people that I know, friends who never even cared about politics, were all of a sudden so concerned about racial equality and about racial justice issues wholesale. And it's those moments that really capture people's attention in a way that I think is deep, long-lasting, and effective, more than forming sort of concentrated strategic delegations. So I think the question is, how do we organize enough around to create some sort of moment of whirlwind where young people are ready to kind of absorb what's happening? And that's tough. I mean, that's an organizing question, and I'm not entirely sure what the answer is.
Thank you, Nick. Here's a question from the chat. How is it that vital information about the military's major contribution to climate change has been so thoroughly withheld? Is this merely a blind spot, or has the US government and military worked in the United Nations and elsewhere to make this an untouchable topic? Well, I know that Dick Cheney wanted it to be an untouchable topic with the Kyoto Protocol. Any thoughts from our panelists on this? Well, we certainly want to change this.
Well, that's one of the issues that's brought up in the slide presentation, is that the U.S. strategy has been one to obfuscate and hide the true nature of the total amount of U.S. military emissions, or even global military emissions. So the U.S. hides behind, well, it's a security issue and it would damage our national security. So going back to the Kyoto Agreement, I think it was in '97, they had strategic omissions of military emissions, but the U.S. never signed on anyway. And I think in the Paris Accords, it was, quote, left to the discretion of the country to decide whether they wanted to report them or not. And so we know where that goes with US, which is the largest emitter of all. So it's not necessarily that it's classified. And we at Veterans for Peace look upon this issue as a foot in the door to seek some kind of commonality with environmental groups or climate activists and Veterans for Peace, in that everybody can agree that transparency is a good thing, right? Well, why don't we start with this little item where we can have success and get transparency to these emissions? And then, by the way, we'd sure like transparency to how they spend our god-darn tax dollars, because the Pentagon has failed all three of the audits that it's faced. But we feel transparency is where we want to start, and it's because of the willful actions of the US government.
I think also that there's an awareness that as soon as you report emissions, that it's very clear that the next step is people are going to be upset about them and ask the military to reduce those emissions because they're comically, cartoonishly high. So it's a predictable next step. So that is why there would be a tremendous amount of resistance against reporting, because we know the reports are going to be real bad. So why would you want to reveal your dirty laundry? But yes, it's absolutely important. And whether you're talking about corporate reporting, the world is changing about the demands being placed on board of directors and asset management companies saying, we're just not going to invest in you unless you report on your emissions. And there's a lot of sort of positive change in that space. And it's nudging in the right direction in terms of corporations having to report so that you have informed consent as an individual buying a product. Like, it's really hard to know like how carbon intensive anything is. This phone versus a different phone. If your pension fund is actually like invested in something that's really harmful, you need the transparency to have informed consent, which in a medical sense is like the baseline understanding before anything can be done. So I think it's super important. I think that there will continue to be a tremendous amount of resistance. I hope that Barbara Lee's resolution works, and we'll see what happens.
Thank you. Gary?
Well, George Jurassic is a retired physics professor from San Diego, and he has posted quite a complex question in the chat for Nick, primarily. Nick freely used the terms inputs, outputs, systems, and equations. This sounds a lot like what we have as one or more multi-input resulting with multi-output systems. There are many such systems in science, which are very complex. For example, Maxwell's equations, which are solvable. I'm glad you're nodding your head, Nick. I wish we could put the climate crisis into such relations. Maybe some climate inputs could be solved with this linear system approach, but only if we have clear relations, which might be impossible. Have you seen anything like this for solving the climate crisis or even contributing to a solution?
That is a very interesting question. Well, I will just say, I guess, the closest thing that we have to something like that is there's a tremendous amount of good work that's done in physical modeling that is like everything you read in the IPCC physical reports is done by very complex dynamical climate models. The tricky part is, trying to do something like that with social systems, which has been really kind of elusive for people who try to research that kind of thing for a long time, just because there's so much more, if you take economics as a good example, economics tries to reduce human behavior to something that you can model equations for. And then it turns out once you start to do that, you start to get systems that aren't actually real. And then economics screws over everybody. So there's also a danger in trying to model everything in some sort of solvable equation that tries to reduce complexity in some sort of way that we can solve, and arguably might kind of come into this, we want to take control of nature and dominate nature kind of metaphor, rather than people and cultures and other groups who have thought about, maybe we don't need to solve it, maybe we should just try to live in right relation as best we can with it. And through emergence, there may be like a more stable system that won't lead to our inevitable destruction.
I hope that makes George happy. I'll hear about it.
Whenever we talk about, this is from the chat, whenever we talk about reducing the military or about dealing with the climate, one of the immediate answers is China. They are the big polluter, or they are upgrading their military and challenging us in the South China Sea. Can we find a way to undercut that boogeyman China argument?
Go ahead, Adrian.
I would say that probably a good solution might be to leave China alone. I think, it's the same thing with Russia. If you look at Russia on a map and foreign military bases, the rest of the world has Russia pretty much surrounded. Maybe China would be less apt to get concerned about military incursions into their country if we weren't sailing our military vessels over into their space and calling it a military exercise. So people always want to blame another person, the other, as the one who's in the wrong. And it's racist, it's white supremacist, it's completely diverting culpability from, the people who rule our roosts here in the United States.
Thank you.
One thing I'll add on that as well from the climate science perspective is that it is only recently that the per annum emissions of China have exceeded the United States, but that's the per annum emissions. Whenever you have this discussion with somebody, the important thing to remember, and I'll repeat it, is what matters is the cumulative emissions. And that would be the emissions from 1860, from the Industrial Revolution that America has emitted, and tack on each amount in aggregate, because that is how it works in terms of trapping heat. The CO2 that was emitted in 1920 is still trapping heat today. So it is about the total amount that any particular nation has put out, not about the per annum emissions. There's a lot of discussion about per annum emissions, about like who's number one, and therefore, well, since we're number two of 200 odd countries, therefore we're in the clear. We're only the second most egregious polluter in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's really the cumulative that you need to look at. And when you do, the US is country miles in front of, it's something like the next three countries combined. It's like China, Russia, and the UK or something. You could add them together because we have pumped out a lot for a very long time. And it's only recently that China exceeded us. And the other component as well that people often do not include is the emissions associated with production ordered by the US. So a certain segment of China's emissions are to build stuff for the US. So it is US demand, and the emissions happen elsewhere because we have offshore production in other countries. So we no longer do the manufacturing, and we allow dirty manufacturing to happen somewhere else. And therefore we turn a blind eye and say, those emissions aren't ours. They are ours because we push it over there and they are serving us. So that is the other bit that you have to drag and drop across when you are actually assigning culpability and assigning blame.
Thank you for those insights, Eric. All right, we don't want to run over. We want to make sure we have time to talk about our actions. So let's go now to concluding statements. Perhaps a minute, take a minute and tell us whatever you want us to leave with in terms of your thoughts and actions we can take. Who would like to go first? Adrian, you want to go first?
I would say that definitely, I've been really, really super impressed with the work of the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project. I think that everything you are doing in terms of pushing this connection, which is incredibly vital between the climate crisis and US militarism in particular, it's probably one of the most important things we could be doing right now in this moment. And to hear the work that you've done in terms of getting the attention of Barbara Lee and demanding that the military start accounting for its emissions it's something that everybody could do with a phone call. To call and raise awareness, call your representatives, let people in your community know. So many people are just blown away when you share with them the truth about pollution and emissions, not to mention the military budget and how it, is gigantic compared to the little small infinitesimal amount of money we put into other priorities that people would find much more valuable and worth our money.
Thank you, Adrienne. Eric, Nick, concluding remarks. Go for it, Nick.
You did point in like the absolute right direction to my video, which I know they're like randomized for everyone. So that was really cool. Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely echo Adrienne. I think the work that you all do is so fantastic. Like putting together the slideshows and bringing those out to educate people and bring them in is so important. It's really central to how I think making change can be done. I guess I'll just conclude by, you know, there are a lot of questions about how to get young people involved. And I hope I didn't point it in too much of like a negative light or anything, but just that like, I really just want to reiterate that at the same time, young people are like coming from different places and simultaneously like really ready to learn this type of stuff and see the way that things work. And we're ready and really excited to build relationships with people that seem long lasting and to be brought into enriching communities. And I think through that work as well, I mean, something that Eric pointed to that I think is really important is like even how intersectional a lot of the young people who get brought into like a culture of militarism is. So working on other issues like addressing, you know, poverty in communities, or not even poverty, but just like addressing educational reform would be huge for like bringing a lot of young people in so they wouldn't have to enlist in the military service to pay for college, right? Or serving your communities who may be over-policed, right? And maybe overly militarized by things like the 1033 program is a great way to meet young people where they're at on the issues that affect them and their own communities, and can build like this sort of intersectional movement that can be so beautiful, that can bring in a lot of folks. And I think, yeah, young people are so excited to do it. We can't wait to like build those connections and form community with everybody.
Thank you, Nick. Eric, concluding remarks.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this panel and to join all of you on this Friday afternoon to have a moment together. I think some of the things I would want to talk about is just making sure that we keep climate change on the agenda all the time in every facet of what you're talking about. You know, we've touched on some of it here, and we touched on, you know, climate change and militarism and basically keeping up the fire. I'm going to be a huge supporter of Barbara Lee's resolution. I hope that everyone else on this call really bangs the drum on that and encourages other people to disseminate that, because it may just be one press release from her office, but that needs to come out and say that the military needs to follow in line with the rest of society. If commercial businesses are starting to report on their emissions, if that is an expectation of what good looks like, the military should also follow, and people should know what that entails. So I think that's really important. I think also that ultimately society is going in the right direction on like a good news story. I think that the real scary bit is how many mega deaths of destruction will there be because of climate change in the interim. And it is to try to reduce the harm and to truncate that change and make it happen as swiftly as possible. It's inevitable for anyone that's read the IPCC headlines. I haven't obviously gone through the entire report yet, but it's baked in. So it's now about trying to transition as quickly as possible and push our foot on the accelerator. And what that means is not necessarily only focusing on individual action. It needs to be from the top down. So it needs to be, the government needs to change, and business needs to change, and individuals need to change. But if all of the focus is on you know, driving an electric car, we're not going to do this in time. It needs to be broader than that, and it needs to be policy down. Thank you. Thank you, Eric. On behalf of Veterans for Peace, for the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, Gary and I want to thank our panelists, Eric Edstrom, Nick Rabb, and Adrienne Kinney, for their participation today and activism every day. At this point, I'd like to remind you
to take action by signing up in the chat. We have various forums. You can volunteer for the working group at veteransforpeace.org, or just Google Veterans for Peace Climate Militarism Project. It will come right up. You can commit to reaching out to community groups in your area, to allies, to invite us to show the slideshow on how militarism fuels the climate crisis. We have a sign-up form for that in the chat. And finally, you can volunteer to be a congressional liaison, to push your member of the House, your senators, to reduce this military budget, and to seek co-sponsorship for Congresswoman Barbara Lee's resolution to track and report the Pentagon's greenhouse gas emissions. So please sign up on the Google form for that in the chat. That brings our workshop to a close. I'm Marcy Winograd. Gary Butterfield and I want to thank our panelists, members of the Veterans for Peace Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, and all of you who showed up today. We encourage you to join us in this critical campaign to reduce militarism and save our planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy, and thank you, panelists, so much from Veterans for Peace. I just want to tell everybody, the audience, do some closing business real quick. Tonight at 6 p.m. Central, we have the plenary Peace at Home and Movement Lessons, and followed by the Poetry and Song Soiree at 8:30 p.m. Central. Join us there. You can also hang out in the social hangout room that's always open during the convention. You go to the convention schedule, scroll down to the bottom, hit that link, and you can be linked up for some post workshop conversations and do some meeting and greeting with your fellow convention goers. Thanks for joining us all, and have a great night.